It's 14th century Europe. Half the people you've ever known are about to die. Your neighbor goes to bed healthy and wakes up dead. The baker you saw yesterday is a corpse on the street. Church bells ring constantly until there's no one left to ring them. Your chances of survival? A coin flip. This was the Black Death. In just a few years, up to 200 million people have died. But some people lived. While entire families were wiped out overnight, others walked away untouched. How did anyone survive the deadliest pandemic in human history? Well, someone had to. Money bought you one thing during the Black Death: distance. When the first bodies started piling up in Florence, the wealthy didn't pray harder or consult better doctors. They packed their bags and fled. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio watched it happen in real time. His famous work, the Decameron, opens with a brutal observation. The rich locked themselves in their homes with quality wine and music, or better yet, escaped to country estates, as though the plague was meant to hurt only those remaining within the city walls. Meanwhile, the poor and middle class were trapped. They caught the plague by the thousands, right there in their own neighborhood, day after day. Rural peasants died like brute beasts rather than human beings, with no doctors, no care, and no options. The statistics are shocking. Wealthy English landowners had a mortality rate of around 27%. Meanwhile, rural tenant farmers, between 40 and 70%. Wealth literally bought you better chances. Not through better medicine, there wasn't any that worked, but through escape. Picture this. You're a Florentine merchant in 1348. You own property in the countryside. When the first plague cases hit the city, you immediately load your family, your best servants, and a few months' worth of supplies onto carts. You head to your rural estate. A well-maintained property with good sanitation, and crucially, relatively few rats. You post guards at your gates with orders to turn away anyone from the city. You wait. Your neighbors in Florence, the artisans and shopkeepers who couldn't afford to leave, are dying in their homes. Bodies stack up in the streets because there aren't enough gravediggers. The city you left behind is transforming into a graveyard. But you're safe in the countryside, drinking wine, reading, waiting for the storm to pass. This wasn't guaranteed success, though. Many farming villages actually had higher death rates than cities. The plague spread through rat fleas, and some rural areas were absolutely infested. The difference was that wealthy estates were maintained. Servants kept buildings clean, supplies were stockpiled for years in advance, and there was also space to isolate if someone did get sick. King Henry VIII understood this perfectly during later plague outbreaks. He turned his court into a nomadic operation, constantly moving between palaces and residences, never staying anywhere long enough for the plague to catch up. He simply had the resources to keep moving. The poor had to stay put and face their fate. On the contrary, the Decameron book perfectly describes this scenario. 10 wealthy young nobles flee plague-ravaged Florence for a luxurious countryside villa. While thousands die behind them, they pass the time telling each other entertaining stories, feasting, and enjoying themselves. It's the perfect symbol of class privilege under catastrophe. The rich could afford to wait out the apocalypse in absolute comfort, and most of them didn't even feel guilty about it. Wealthy merchants abandoned their sick servants without a second thought. They refused to open their grain stores to feed the starving. Some even fled through multiple towns, possibly spreading their infection further because their safety mattered more than anyone else's. The social contract of medieval society was shattering. The idea that nobles had obligations to their people and that the rich had responsibilities to the poor evaporated the second the Black Death came knocking. Everyone who could afford to run did exactly that. But here's what makes this survival strategy both effective and infuriating. It worked. If you had the money to flee to a well-maintained, rat-free estate and the discipline to stay isolated for months, your odds of survival jumped dramatically. The problem? Maybe 5 to 10% of the population could afford this option. Everyone else had to find another way or die trying. While the rich ran and the poor died, a handful of cities discovered something revolutionary. Isolation works. This seems obvious now, but remember, nobody knew what caused the plague. The best medical minds in Europe believed it was caused by corrupted air or some sort of magic. They thought the disease spread through bad smells. They had no concept of bacteria, germs, or contagion as we understand it today. So when some cities figured out that separating the sick from the healthy actually worked, it was pure observation and desperate experimentation. The city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, made medical history on July 27, 1377. City officials passed a law. Anyone arriving from plague-infected regions had to spend 30 days isolated before entering the city. They used an island called Mrkan and the town of Cautat as quarantine zones. Later, they extended it to 40 days. They called it Quarantino. Sounds familiar? These officials didn't understand disease transmission, but they observed that plague took time to show symptoms. They realized healthy-looking people could still be carrying death with them, so they created a mandatory waiting period. If you developed symptoms during isolation, you stayed isolated. If you made it 40 days without getting sick, you could enter the city. It was brilliant, and it saved lives. Venice also took this concept and ran with it. The city established lazaretos, which were entire islands in the lagoon dedicated to quarantine. These weren't prisons. They were hospitals where arriving ships and their crews received food, clean bedding, and medical care for 40 days before being allowed into Venice. The Venetian government was spending an enormous amount of money on public health infrastructure that existed solely to manage the plague. The Venetians were pragmatic merchants. They understood that letting plague into their city would completely destroy their economy far worse than any quarantine restriction ever could. So they enforced it ruthlessly. Ship captains who lied about not having plague on board faced massive fines or worse. On top of that, guards constantly patrolled the lagoon to prevent ships from sneaking past the quarantine islands. Then there was Milan. Milan's response was brutality on another level. When plague cases appeared in a household, the Milanese authorities didn't just quarantine the building, they sealed it completely. They bricked up the doors and windows with the occupants still inside. Sick and healthy family members alike were entombed in their own homes, left either to recover or die. 3 entire houses were reportedly walled up this way, the people inside screaming until they couldn't anymore. Milan also built pest houses outside the city walls. These were isolated facilities where plague victims were forcibly sent to. Families were torn apart, and the sick were carted away to die far from their loved ones. It was cold, calculated, and horrifying. But it also worked. Milan had one of the lowest mortality rates of any major Italian city during the Black Death. But the port city of Pistoia created even stricter rules. No travel to infected cities, no entry for anyone from the plague zones, massive fines for violations, and armed guards at city gates checking everyone. Goods were disinfected before entering, bodies had to be buried quickly in deep graves, and public gatherings were banned. Funerals were limited to immediate family only. These cities were inventing public health policy in real time, based on wrong theories but correct observations. They thought they were stopping corrupted air. In reality, they were just preventing the spread of the disease. The measures weren't perfect, though. Medieval quarantine was full of holes. Rich merchants bribed their way through checkpoints. Desperate refugees evaded guards. Ships lied about their cargo and crew health. But cities with strict quarantine consistently had lower death rates than those without any measures at all. And quarantine did something else crucially. It prevented complete social collapse. When people feel utterly helpless against an invisible enemy, societies can disintegrate into looting, violence, and chaos. Quarantine gave the citizens a sense that someone was doing something, that authorities had a plan. It provided psychological comfort, even when it couldn't provide a cure. So here's survival strategy number 2. Live in a city with authorities smart enough and ruthless enough to enforce strict isolation. If your city was too disorganized, too dependent on trade to close its ports, or too slow to react, you were in serious trouble. Here's something that medieval people had no way of knowing. Some of them were completely immune from the Black Death. Recent research on bones from plague pits revealed that survivors were more likely to carry specific gene variants that boosted their immune systems. People with these genes had up to a 40% better chance of surviving plague than those without them. It's the strongest evolutionary pressure ever recorded in human populations. But nobody in 1348 understood this. Imagine being one of the lucky ones. You tend to your dying mother, breathing the same air, touching her fevered skin, and you never get sick. Your siblings get sick and die while you remain perfectly healthy. You have no idea why. The mechanism was simple. Some people's immune systems could recognize and fight off the plague bacteria more effectively. Others couldn't. It was genetic lottery, nothing more. And there's a dark twist. Those protective genes are now associated with increased risk for autoimmune disease like Crohn's disease. The genetic advantage that saved medieval Europeans is causing chronic health problems in their descendants today. So, survival strategy 3. Be born with the right genes, not particularly useful advice. But it explains why some people walked through plague-ravaged streets, handled infected corpses, and never caught the disease. Medieval people tried everything to avoid plague. Most of it was useless or even actively harmful. But a few superstitious practices accidentally stumbled onto something that actually worked. Wealthy households burned aromatic woods like juniper and rosemary. They carried sponges soaked in vinegar, holding them over their noses when going outside. They even hung herbs and onions around their necks. Did these things filter out plague bacteria or kill fleas? Of course not. But the constant awareness of corrupted air made people more cautious about proximity to the sick. They avoided crowds and stayed away from plague victims. They were essentially practicing social distancing without even knowing it. Religious authorities recommended confession and prayer, which often involved isolating oneself in quiet contemplation rather than attending crowded church services. Some people even took extended religious retreats to monasteries in remote areas. Again, the theology was wrong, but the isolation helped. The practice of burying bodies quickly and deep also helped, though medieval people didn't understand why. They thought it prevented corrupted air spreading from the corpses. In reality, it reduced the number of fleas that could jump from dead bodies onto new victims. Not all superstitions helped, of course. Flagellants, who were medieval Christian fanatics, started whipping themselves in public, creating massive gatherings that spread the plague even faster. This got so bad in some cities that the flagellant ceremonies started getting banned. If avoiding plague through superstition sometimes worked by accident, medieval medicine was an unmitigated disaster. The doctors of the University of Paris, the finest medical minds in Europe, couldn't figure it out. Their entire framework was based on the ancient Greek theory of humors: blood, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease meant that these fluids were out of balance. Their solution to the plague? Restore balance by draining blood from patients already dying from infection. It killed people faster. Medieval doctors also advised against bathing. In an era when sanitation was already terrible, actively discouraging washing made everything worse, because the doctors told them to. Then there were the bizarre remedies. The Vicary method involved taking a live chicken, plucking the feathers from its rear, and tying it to the patient so the chicken's backside pressed against the infections. The idea was that chickens breathed through their bottoms and would suck the infection out. This obviously didn't work. People also consumed theriac, a supposed cure made from dozens of ingredients including viper flesh and opium. It didn't cure the plague either. Others ground up precious stones like emeralds and ate them. They wore amulets inscribed with prayers or magical symbols. None of it worked. Some doctors even considered drinking your own urine or consuming literal animal waste. The logic was that fighting fire with fire would somehow balance out the plague's corruption. It just ended up poisoning people who were already dying. Later, plague doctors started wearing the famous beaked masks. They stuffed the beaks with aromatic herbs, believing it protected them from the corrupted air. It didn't. The masks might have provided minor protection from respiratory droplets, but most plague doctors still died. The psychological impact of medical failure was devastating. When your best knowledge is worthless against an enemy you can't understand, despair sets in. Faith in institutions crumbled. The church couldn't stop it through prayer, medicine couldn't cure it through treatment, government couldn't prevent it through policy. So survival strategy 4 was ignore almost everything medieval doctors told you to do. Trust your instincts, avoid the sick, and pray you got lucky. By 1351, the worst had passed. The survivors emerged into a transformed world. Due to so many dead, the labor shortage gave peasants power for the first time in centuries. Wages nearly tripled. Serfs demanded freedom and often got it, but the scars ran deep. Art became obsessed with death. The Danse Macabre showed skeletons dancing everyone to their graves. Europe wouldn't recover its pre-plague population for another 250 years. The Black Death survival strategies were simple. Be rich enough to flee, live in a city with strict quarantine, be born with the right genes, and ignore medical advice. Most people had no control over any of these factors. I'm George from Mystery Vault. Drop a like if you enjoyed the video.